Welcome back, and I have to reiterate that I admire the discipline with which you have returned to the audience, not least because it's actually ahead of time now. Now to the last session of the day. We've been looking at the thoughts of future conflict, technological drivers, and now we'll look at non-technological drivers. And to guide us through it, it's my pleasure to reintroduce Peter Viggo Jacobsen, and it's all yours.
Thank you very much. I think I'll do something different for a change. Instead of reading up of their bios, if you don't know them already, and you really ought to know them already, I suggest you take a quick look in the program, look up on the bios, so we can save time in that way. So instead of my wasting time, I'm telling you who's up here. I'll just ask them to start and go by the order of the program. So Olivier will start, then David will take over, and then Henrik will finish it off. And they have 20 minutes each, and I'll do something drastic if you don't stick to the timetable. So the rules of engagement haven't changed. So take it away.
All right, thank you, Peter Viggo, and thanks to everyone for staying with us for the last panel in the afternoon. So I admit, when I received the invitation for this conference, it was stated in the email, can you talk about the future of war, but not about technology? And I was, damn, that makes it much more difficult. So I had to come up with something eventually related to political issues, and I thought it will be interesting to try to discuss with you this afternoon the issue of our future enemies. Because, in a sense, any thinking about the future of war must take into account some thinking about our future enemies. We have been discussing this afternoon and this morning as well, some trends and in technological developments that will shape the future of warfare. But the future of war itself, as has always been the case, will be determined by who is fighting, meaning the belligerents. And in turn, the belligerents will be determined by the evolution of the political and strategic contexts, the confrontation of interests, as well as mutual representations and misperceptions. So what I would like to do in the 19 minutes will be to offer you some food for thoughts, acknowledging that determining who the enemy is very political, and I'll get back to this, and any form of anticipation is incredibly difficult, so I'll be likely proven wrong, but I'm okay with that. I hope to spark a discussion. So first, let's have a look at the conduct of military operations. Thinking about the enemy is, of course, not alien to military professionals, right? It's absolutely fundamental for tactical and operational planning. And usually we are here talking about an enemy force that has already been designed as such by political authorities. Therefore, in military thinking, the enemy is usually defined in terms of its capacity to inflict harm to the friendly forces. So, for example, the French military doctrine defines the enemy as an individual, a group of individuals, organized or not, a military or paramilitary group, a national entity or alliance, which manifests itself by deliberately hostile activities against the friendly forces and must therefore be fought. The objective of such definition, emphasizing the hostile intent and the capability to inflict harm, is of course to plan tactical and operational maneuvers in order to confront and defeat the enemy. But divergences in military planning, even within NATO, already reveal different ways of thinking about the enemy. Let's begin with some fundamentals. As military planners, what you need to know is a number of things about the enemy. Its form, is it a terrorist group, is it a state? You need to know its objectives, including its strategic and operational and tactical objectives. You need to know its environment, hence the importance of the intelligence preparation of the battlefield. You need to know its capabilities, and you need to know its patterns of actions. However, basically you have two different approaches that can be applied in order to evaluate the characteristics of the enemy. Either a deductive approach or a systemic analysis. The deductive approach is slightly more traditional, and it's organized around three main steps: observation, deduction, conclusion. So for example, the observation phase can be the detection of enemy units and their characteristics, such as their strengths, their size. From this observation, the second phase, which is a deduction, can be an assessment of the likely format and size of the enemy. And therefore, the third phase, conclusion, can be, for example, a request for extra capabilities in order to counter the estimated strengths of the enemy. Usually, this approach is well adapted to the study of one single enemy. However, contemporary conflicts are usually more complex, and systemic analysis are now more widespread. In this approach, every actor in the environment is conceived as part of a system. And this is a type of approach that produced the now infamous spaghetti ball slide summarizing the Afghan conflict, which led General McChrystal to declare, when we understand this slide, we will have won the war. And apparently we still haven't understood the slide correctly. So systemic analysis is particularly helpful in order to illustrate interactions between different actors, but also to think about multiple lines of operations beyond kinetic force, civil military interactions, communications, cyber, and so on and so forth. However, it is an extremely time-consuming process. For operational purposes, it can be difficult to bound the system under analysis, because in theory you can extend the system indefinitely, and the analysis must be updated constantly with new data. Therefore, the systemic analysis is particularly helpful for strategic and operative headquarters, which have the necessary resource to undertake complex endeavors. However, at the tactical level, the deductive approach is probably more appropriate, notably because the decision-making time is compressed and resources are more limited. The main challenge for the future will be to ensure that the tactical elements will beneficiate from the battle space knowledge developed at the operational and strategic levels, while maintaining reactivity and without overloading subordinates with irrelevant information. Once the enemy is understood, or at least described, using either the deductive or the approach or the systemic analysis, its potential actions can be assessed. And it is here that major differences can be observed among NATO countries. Basically, you have two schools, either a possibilist school or a probabilistic school. The possibilist school can be traced back to Napoleon, and that guy distrusts intelligence because he thought that intelligence was all too likely to be used as a confirmation of prior inclinations. Basically, he thought that intelligence could only reinforce prior biases. Therefore, he advised to never imagine what the enemy will do, but think about what the enemy can do. Hence the name possibilist school. The focus is on possibilities open to the enemy. On the opposite, we have a probabilistic school, which is influenced by Helmut von Moltke, and considers that based on known doctrine, past practices, and objectives of the enemy, it is possible to concentrate on a number of likely courses of actions. So the possibilist school reduces the risk of surprise at the cost of potentially dispersing the capabilities, because you have to counter every possible mode of action. And the probabilistic school rationalizes the effort at the cost of potentially over-determining what the enemy will do. The dominating planning method within NATO is currently probabilistic. It requires to classify the potential activities by the enemy and rank them according to two criteria, probability and danger. So the overall logic of the approach is to try assessing the enemy's intentions based on a number of hypotheses in order to concentrate the resources. In the possibilist approach, there is no hard distinction between probability and danger. Two, and only two, potential modes of action for the enemy are identified, which are both probable and dangerous. However, the possibilist school usually remains relatively vague when describing what the enemy could do. In that sense, it will be more appropriate to characterize the possibilist approach as an effort to identify categories of potential enemy activities, instead of trying to anticipate the likely maneuvers of the enemy. And these two different approaches reflect different understanding of the nature of the enemy. If you are in a probabilistic approach, in a sense, with enough resources, adequate intelligence, you can lift the fog of war, right? And basically you can try to guess and assess the enemy's intention. In contrast, if you adopt the possibilist approach, you recognize that the enemy, by nature, is unpredictable. And operational planning must therefore integrate a degree of uncertainty about the enemy's intention. In that sense, what does the future hold for determining the enemy at the tactical and operational levels? First, artificial intelligence may facilitate the convergence between the different schools I've described so far. With the capabilities to analyze a vast number of data, AIs could help determine enemies' patterns of action, which would remain invisible to human staff officers. So, for example, the American Project Maven was deployed in Syria and Iraq in 2018 to automatically analyze thousands of hours of videos recorded by drones deployed in the region, and those could never have been exploited by human analysts. AI could also facilitate the exchange of information between the tactical, operational, and strategic headquarters. Second, with a more systematic use of cognitive sciences, we could make officers much more aware of their own intellectual biases. Therefore, our methods of determining the enemy and anticipating its modes of action are likely to dramatically change in the future, and that could change the nature of work in headquarters. Now, moving on from the conduct of operations to defense planning. To put it crudely, you have two forms of defense planning. The first one is to adjust defense capabilities to an identified enemy. So it's a kind of threat-based planning, like we did during the Cold War. Basically, most Western forces, structures, and doctrines were based on facing the Soviet Union. You could, in the absence of a declared enemy, you could also revert to a kind of must-have capability approach. So it's capability-based defense planning. Therefore, identifying an enemy or several enemies has important consequences for the force structure, for the justification of defense spending, but also for the training of soldiers and officers. In that regard, current and future developments are likely to be challenging for defense planning. One of the main characteristics of contemporary warfare is a rise of plausible deniability in many forms, and we have been discussing this through the concept of liminal maneuver, for example. So we can have plausible deniability with the use of paramilitary or proxy forces. Look at Russia in Ukraine. It's the use of private and security military companies. The use of standoff platforms, which allow participation in a conflict without further engagement. The use of offensive cyber capabilities, which complicate attribution. Or the saturation of the information environment. The combination of those trends reduces the costs of using coercive tools. We can thus expect an increase in the overall level of conflictuality, which will remain below the threshold of open hostilities. This complicates defense planning for several reasons. First, because it is plausible deniability, it will be more politically risky to adopt threat-based defense planning. The enemy will be there conducting hostile operations, but clearly naming and shaming the enemy could politically backfire. Because once named, the enemy could easily ask for proofs of their hostile actions, which will be difficult to furnish. It could lead to political turmoils at home. For example, you can imagine opposition parties accusing the government of warmongering. But it could also give a pretext to the enemy for openly escalating now. So presenting an escalation as a defensive move. So adopting threat-based defense planning will have to be carefully balanced with managing potential escalation. Simultaneously, capability-based defense planning could be politically difficult to justify. In the absence of a declared enemy, why invest in military capabilities? Therefore, future defense planning will have to manage this tension between naming and shaming an increasingly elusive enemy at the risk of provoking escalation, and, on the other side, justifying defense investments in an era of fiscal restraint. Now, after having discussed the operational and defense planning consequences of identifying the enemy, I would like to move on to the political dimension of identifying the enemy. One must first distinguish between an adversary and an enemy. An adversary is a state or a group or whatever you want with which we can be in competition, but not in a state of open hostility. Think about China today, who are in competition, but not yet in a state of open hostility. Of course, an adversary can always become an enemy, but it's not necessarily the case. Second, there is a number of pitfalls that must be avoided when dealing with an enemy in political terms. First, there is a tendency to treat the enemy as a criminal, which must be punished. This leads to military force being used as a kind of international police force in never-ending military interventions. Why? Because this overlooks the enemy's political motivations. Ultimately, using military force is about shifting political conditions. If we deny politics by criminalizing the enemy, this leads to strategic mistakes. The second pitfall is essentializing the enemy as an absolute evil, which must be destroyed, which is also another way to deny politics. Let's take the example of the so-called Islamic State, which made that mistake by considering everyone else as an enemy that has to be either subjugated or destroyed. Basically, they paid a huge price for us. They are still out there, but they took a heavy blow because they managed to coalesce everyone else against them. The third mistake is to consider that if you don't want an enemy, you won't have any. It is a form of hubris to consider that every single political dynamic is under our control. But as the French political philosopher Julian Freud once wrote, you don't get to choose the enemy. The enemy chooses you. We must therefore be aware that we might be engaged in a conflict for reasons beyond our control and against our will. Based on those considerations and keeping those pitfalls in mind, what can we say about our future enemies? Western countries are deeply divided, as you know. A few years ago, the then French Defense Minister, Jean-Yves Le Drian, published a short book entitled Who is the Enemy?, in which he identified jihadist groups as the main threat. Last week, General Mark Carlton Smith, the British Army chief, declared that Russia is indisputably a greater threat than Islamist extremist groups. This divergence of assessment between the two most powerful countries in Europe is usually euphemized in NATO speak as divergences regarding the southern flank and the eastern flank. And this divide runs deep within the organization. At the same time, great power competition is back. And this creates specific problems for NATO in an era when the US engagement and support cannot be taken for granted, despite the party line of look at the policies and not the tweets. Just yesterday, German Foreign Minister Heiko Maas also recognized that if Europe is to overcome current strategic challenges, it has to strengthen its cohesion. Unite or decline, he said. This also echoes President Macron's call for European strategic autonomy, which is not decoupled from NATO, it's not 90s anymore, but in service of European interests. This will force European countries to acknowledge strategic competition and learn to differentiate between allies, partners, adversaries, and enemies. And this will be extremely difficult because foreign policy issues are now becoming politicized. For a very long time, there was in Western countries a transpartisan elite consensus on core foreign policy issues. This consensus is exploding, and foreign policy issues are becoming intertwined with national politics. Determining who is the enemy has more and more to do with political preferences than with strategic thinking. As a concluding thought, I would like to mobilize the old distinction the Greeks used to make between stasis and polemos. Stasis refers to dissent, including violent dissent, between the Greeks themselves. We could translate it as strife, in a sense. Polemos, of course, refers to war and was reserved to non-Greek people, against whom all gloves were off. The long history of Western countries is an attempt to civilize stasis, and the form we have found to be the most effective is basically liberal democracy. We organize power transition without resorting to violence. However, I am concerned that current political trends lead towards the return of polemos, not against others, but against ourselves. Everywhere in Western countries, identity politics, national populists, and white supremacist discourses are on the rise. Sometimes, actors using those discourses are in power, like in the US, Hungary, or Italy. Sometimes they are narrowly defeated, like in France. Sometimes they are kingmakers for coalition governments. Simultaneously, we see a rise of right-wing violent activism. It's clearly visible in the US, where right-wing militias have a long history, but it's also observable in the UK, in France, or in Germany. It comes with dehumanizing and securitizing discourses against certain categories of population, first migrants, then non-white people, then Jews, then all foreigners. And those speeches are widely available thanks to the internet and social media, and can sometimes become part of mainstream political discourse, questioning the resilience of our institutions. Of course, those discourses are the mirror image of jihadist discourses, and they feed each other, contributing to the polarization and fragmentation of our societies. This, I believe, is quite dangerous because those attitudes lead to a shift from the regulated political confrontation, which is stasis, to the identification of an internal enemy, which by definition must be defeated, which is polemos. And while we are obsessed with finding enemies at home, we may lose sight of the enemies who consider us as such abroad. Therefore, when thinking about the future enemy in political terms, the main challenge ahead is to make sure that stasis will not turn into polemos at home, while keeping track of whether our adversaries turn into enemies abroad. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Olivier. Now, there's a challenge for the British. The French were able to do it on time, so are you up to that as well?
Feel free to just shut me off when I hit the limit. I don't have a watch, and let's see how it goes. All right. I'm really happy that there is a panel on non-technological drivers of war at Future War Conference, and I'm really delighted that I'm on that panel, because usually I'm not, and usually the conferences don't have non-technological driver sections. So thanks very much to the organizers of this. Before I go on, are there any cabinet government ministers here today? Any politicians? Elected politicians? Right. That's a shame, but typical. Maybe next time. Right. Okay. So that I ask because I think that's the supremely important question here, and it puts into perspective what I think are the three main non-technological drivers that I'll talk. And I think these are obvious, but I'll state them quickly just for going on. I hope that I can say some things which are not obvious as we go on. The factors that are driving the future of war are powerful, long-standing, largely non-technological, or only indirectly related to technology, and they likely are going to continue to strengthen in coming decades, absent some paradigm-changing black swan type of event. They include a leadership perception of war as essentially a tool of consequence management or of risk management, and not as a thing which we do for the pursuit of victory per se. If you're in the position of being a strategist or trying to do strategy and victory is not on the table or can't even be articulated, well, good luck to you. The second point is that this is especially consequential in the context of offensive liberal wars, or wars of choice, as they are often referred to, such as have typified the security landscape since the end of the Cold War, and are likely to continue. But thirdly, both of these factors are aggravated by advancements in connectedness that expose the home front to formerly distant small wars in ways that consistently imperil the maintenance of political will in the event of any, even small, tactical setback. What's the upshot of this? Well, that's the reason today I'm talking about fortifications. I think that the future of warfare, next 10 years, 20, probably 30, is not, as is usually talked about in these conferences, kind of continued growth of maneuverism, doing things lighter, faster, cheaper, more decisively, so on and so forth. It's actually more continuation of the present. But it depends how you, the trick is to understand the present and the past. I'll mostly be talking about the past. We already see these factors evident, manifested in military operations now, where what we see are very rare instances of bold maneuver that are interspersed in a much more general pattern of hunkering down, fortifying, fighting in place, or conducting fighting withdrawals to points of refuge, often for purposes of casualty evacuation. Okay, why are we looking at this? I want to talk about citadels. I may only get through citadels. I said I was going to talk about citadels, marching camps, and linear barriers. I'm not going to get to linear barriers. I might not get through marching camps. So let's just work with citadels. This obviously is a picture of Afghanistan. A citadel is a kind of fortress, but it's important to think about the sort of fortress it is. The clue is in the name. It means little city, right? And a citadel is a fortress that is normally located within a town or a city, which it is designed to command, both literally and symbolically. It's a piece of strategic architecture that exists in a relationship with a population, in other words. And its function is to provide a base for pacification, for policing, and for civil administration. Stabilization in modern parlance, if you will, or governments. It's a government machine. It's not a fighting machine. It's a machine for emanating governance, usually out to the distance of one day's march and back. In other words, the primary function of a citadel is not fighting, while occasionally they are used for that purpose. It's for patrolling from. You can see the strategic logic of the citadel written all over the landscape of Europe. So if we were to look at, not of Afghanistan, but if we were looking at a map of Wales today, we would see how the English dominance of Wales was secured in the 13th century through the construction of a network of stone castles, most of which still exist, each of which was not more than one day's travel from any other, usually accompanied by the carefully planned township, in which colonists, administrators, necessary tradesmen, and the like could live in relative safety. Another example closer to Denmark would be the 2-century campaign of the Teutonic Knights to Christianize the pagan Prussians, which has left, a campaign which finally fizzled out in the middle of the 15th century, and left behind a similar architectural legacy of magnificent cathedrals / castles, citadels dotted throughout modern-day Poland and into Lithuania. The point here is not to recap a history of millennia of military fortification. It is rather to point out that just to imagine the story of citadels as a series of discrete accounts of sieges and battles is to fail to understand what they're primarily about, which is government. Now consider this map, which shows the major NATO airfields, forward operating FOBs, and key encampments of ISAF in Afghanistan. You can see the areas where the major fighting took place, the major transportation networks, river valleys, and the like. Pay attention. This could as well be a map of Teutonic castles in Prussia or English castles in Wales in terms of the mutual proximity, the relationship with population centers and of enemy action, and their location astride key transportation communications networks. The logic of where they are located and why they are why is entirely strategically similar. With a slightly greater level of granularity, we could observe that some of these are sustained primarily or solely by air today, which obviously was not a capability available to the Teutons, which obviously allows for greater existence to exist between citadels in theory, yet strikingly in practice, most of these are still one day's march apart. Pretty much essentially where Alexander the Great might have put them 2,500 years before. Right. In August and September of 2010 rather, I was invited to go to Afghanistan at the invitation of ISAF to conduct research on strategic communications. I was asked to go and interview a lot of people going from headquarters in Kabul all the way down to people handing out leaflets in Helmand province. But I visited a lot of the citadels I just mentioned. And the experience was highly instructive. But my main and lasting observations were not what I expected them to be. This sketch is one of them. I did it on late afternoon at Kandahar Airfield. Many of you probably have been there, which was then arguably the largest NATO base in the country. It had a daytime population of about 20,000, nighttime population about just over half that when all the Afghans went home. And it represents an extremely typical scene. A soldier is restringing a coil of razor wire atop the HESCO barrier forming the perimeter of the base. On one side of the barrier, the inside barrier where I'm standing, you have a kind of slightly odd, abnormally dusty town full of industrious office workers, blue-collar tradesmen, and the like. On the other side, there's a ditch, another coil of, another string of razor wire, and then Afghanistan, which which is effectively still a far distant country for all but a tiny fraction of the people on the inside. Not more than 10% would go on the other side of this, on the other side of these ramparts. The thought that occurred to me at the time was this. In 1,000 years, what are archaeologists going to think of this mysterious Hesco Empire that appeared seemingly out of nowhere in the first years of the 3rd millennium AD? It's left its mark all over the globe. So let's talk about Hesco, this Hesco bastion. You've all seen it, right? Of course you've seen it. It's essentially a gabion. It's a 15th century technology, a basket filled with earth and rubble that creates a ballistic barrier. It's a work of simple genius, I think, Hesco. It's flat packable, it's stackable, it's standardized, it's modular, and it's cheap. It occurred to me that Hesco symbolizes the Afghanistan war in the way that the Huey helicopter did the Vietnam War. In the Vietnam War, we reinvented cavalry as air cavalry, flanking attacks and coup de main appearing from the sky. In today's wars, we've reinvented castellation, modular, flat-packable, semi-instant fortresses that mix military engineering with the design philosophies of IKEA and Lego. Great Danish product. Unfortunately, well, for you, Hesco is a British product. It's customary to decry this state of strategic affairs, and I've done so myself. It's certainly very morally dubious on a number of levels. Not the day I did this, but one afternoon, I recall one afternoon, again in Kandahar, sipping a strawberry milkshake while there was a air warning or whatever, the sirens blasting, meant we had to go underneath the table, put our helmets on and go underneath the table. So I'm sipping a strawberry milkshake underneath the table inside a shipping container office while reading a Congressional Research Service report called Warlord Inc., which is all about the way in which the Taliban was thriving on protection money paid to it by commercial firms servicing ISAF's supply chain. I ran the extra calories off that night in the base gym, which is very nice, very big and air-conditioned. It was probably the most expensive milkshake in history. It's very hard to justify this, I think. On the other hand, I don't expect much to change fundamentally. The urge on the part of your government, as my government, to do something, but make it cheap, that animates so much of the West's strategic enterprise shows no sign of permanent decline, however salutary the lessons of Afghanistan and Iraq have been. Indeed, given the apparently likely effects of, say, climate change on environments in Africa particularly, combined with schismatic civil war in the Middle East, on top of massive population growth in the region, there's good reason to think that it will increase, even if only out of self-interest, i.e. to head off more and larger refugee crises that have the potential to be many times larger than they are now. So there's going to be many more occasions where in order to do anything in a place, strategists will have to create bases like this. Because they will need to protect a lot of very expensive soft targets, possibly the means of building an entire new civil administration, as well as a range of machines requiring specialist support, often non-military, plus policemen, and the means to train new police. Technology is not driving these things, except insofar as IT underpins some of the risk-averse culture that underpins the tenuousness of political will. Consider another example. Recently, I interviewed the CEO of a large multinational agricultural enterprise. It's a company that owns farmland primarily in North America that amounts, I would say, to a good fraction of the size of Denmark. Maybe half, maybe 3/4. This is a company that has pioneered the use of artificially intelligent robotic combine harvesters, planters of all kinds. They use predictive data, they use big data to do gigantic level farming enterprises. As I said, they farm a huge area, and they have a permanent staff of less than 1,000 people. To give you, this company determined that a very good place to invest would be Sudan. Very interesting. You might say, why would you invest in Sudan? Well, it turns out that as far as these big firms are concerned, quality of soil doesn't really matter anymore. It's just a substrate. The people are not particularly needed. You need a flat area without stuff on it. And Sudan meets all of those criteria. The problem for them was the insurance on the combines. For point of reference, the value of these machines is so high that the total annual demand for the whole of North American market, biggest agricultural market in the world, is about 350 units per year, 50 of which are bought by this one company. So it's the insurance on those combines, and it's the insurance on the personnel who service them. The result? No investment. They can't go into Sudan despite the critical need of Sudan for food and a means of generating wealth. Okay, here's another picture. Some of you will recognize this. I knew you would. It's a citadel. This is a picture of, well, actually it's a museum now. I've taken a few liberties with the drawing. That flag was not flying there anymore, but being a bit romantic, I put it there. Anyway, this is a Taggart fort. Taggart forts, let me go back. The problem with the citadels that I visited in Afghanistan is not that they're out of place or out of time, because in actuality, they're quite well placed. It makes sense where they are. And the time is as right as it ever was, as it ever will be. Quite clearly, the place is ill-administered. It is ill-administered. The problem is that they're not awesome, okay? And nor are they harnessed in any plausible way to a long-term plan of governance. Edward I's castles in Wales were built to last and to exude power, both literal and symbolic, permanently. The Teutons Marienburg Fortress, you can go and see it's a thing of beauty, right? Though it's no longer a seat of power. For that matter, although it no longer exists because it's been subsumed by the city of Grozny, the Groznaya Fortress, which was built by the Russians in 1818 to cement their conquest of the Caucasus, literally meant awesome. Kandahar Airfield is 2 minutes, gosh. Kandahar Airfield is a gigantic and impressive display of military power, to be sure, but it's not awesome. It's powerful, but temporary. When you look at it, you see nothing that is not easy to abandon without regret or to take away. Ironically, it was trying to help people whose job it was to communicate to Afghans the message, we're here to stay, whatever happens, you will be protected, who happened to be living in tents and working out of shipping containers as they said these things, to make me realize that stuff still matters. So for a vision of the future, I think this is not a bad place to start. It's the police station, or formerly the police fortress in Latrun, now an IDF Army base and museum. It's one of more than 70 that were designed and built by Sir Charles Taggart, who was a renowned British imperial policeman, as part of a system to suppress the Arab revolt. It was successful. It was generally for the policing of mandatory Palestine. Most Taggart forts are still in use of one sort or another, prisons, police stations, what have you. They are sturdy structures built of thick concrete, reinforced with steel. They have secure internal water and power supplies in many cases, extensive living spaces, internal living spaces, offices, equipment, maintenance areas, and the like. As with other pacification systems already described, they're cited as a network purposefully in relation to population centers and transport routes. They're not going to win an architectural award, but actually they're not aesthetically unpleasing. Okay, I'm not going to talk about marching camps, but I do want to just say a few words about this sketch. This is another one I did in Afghanistan, and it was on one of the few days I was allowed out on the ground. We went to the Maiwand District Center, and this sketch is done from the ramparts of a 19th century caravanserai, which is located here to the east of the district center, right alongside Highway 1. In the distance, you can see the site of the Battle of Maiwand. Battle of Maiwand was one of the great defeats of British imperial enterprise. 2 brigades were routed that day, 1,000 guys killed. The Afghans remember it. We tend to have forgotten it. I wasn't allowed to go to the battle site itself because it was considered too dangerous to go off the road or anywhere near the 2 small villages up there, which were considered uncontrolled. The caravans, in the middle there is a destroyed BTR, Soviet-era armored personnel carrier, detritus of another more recent war. We weren't allowed to go up to that either, although, as again, it was uncontrolled area, although the place was full of Afghan goat herders. The important bit I wanted to point at is this thing. That is a combat outpost, and it's located further east of the caravanserai right there. That combat outpost is HESCO construction with a big radio mast sticking out the top, and it's part of the FOB Wilson, or basically reports to a larger FOB that's much further to the east. The important thing about that is that's built on an Alexandrian fort. The foundations of that, so basically for 2,500 years, off and on, guys have been sitting there doing exactly the same thing, watching that road and repeating signals back and forth, guarding supply movements. So the future of war is going to look a lot like what it looks now and what it has always looked like. If there's my big message here is that I think we're at the end of the mobility era for a while. There's going to be more hunkering down, but eventually, hopefully later and not sooner, there will be a new Genghis Khan or Napoleon come along, and it will restore some movement. Maybe it will be you guys. Maybe that's what we're training, but I'm afraid I think this guy is unlikely to come out of a staff college. I'm sorry for going over. Right.
So, thank you. I'm honored to be here to talk to all of you here today. In particularly, I'm honored to give this talk with Professor van Creveld in the audience, although he might, of course, not agree with everything I have to say. Whoops, there we go. Martin van Creveld's 1991 book, The Transformation of War, contained an almost prophetic analysis of the changing condition and character of warfare. an analysis that kept being relevant all the way through the post-Cold War era's so-called misnamed New Wars, and later global war on terror. Since 2014, however, the end of the post-Cold War era means a return to protracted, multi-dimensional great power conflict, and therefore deterrence, and a somewhat Trinitarian logic. But, I will argue, it is also possible to discern clear non-Trinitarian logics in the new landscape. So instead of abandoning all connections between Clausewitz's three constitutive elements, the government, the armed forces, and the people, these new logics appear when combining the elements in new old ways. I would argue that these become warlordism, a warfare without the government or the state, robotics, a warfare without the people, and finally, perhaps most intriguingly, subversion, warfare without the armed forces. The book appeared in 1991, in the age of the Gulf War and the end of the Cold War confrontation. The book's grand and important argument is to take issue with one of Karl von Clausewitz's central contentions. To Clausewitz, the new era of Napoleon's levée en masse had resulted in new forces being unleashed that had to be analyzed with regard to war. To Clausewitz, these constitutive elements were the now well-known government or reason, armed forces or chance, and thirdly, the people or passion, or as it truly were in the book, hatred. Now, the book Transformation of War does one simple but very powerful thing to this construct, and that is to historicize it. Historicizing means showing how the Trinitarian construct reflected a particular constellation of factors in a particular moment in history, that this was very different in earlier periods, and that even in Clausewitz's own age it was only partially valid, and that it never reflected the actual character of the most prevalent forms of war. And the book then devastatingly points to the reception, the effect of the strategic institution taking these ideas into account and acting on them. And so, this becomes a central contribution to understanding why in Afghanistan, in Syria, in Libya, Maghreb, but also in Russia, as we shall see in some ways, our means and machinery do not often fit the problems at hand. Like Clausewitz's On War was a strategic midwife turning structural changes of its time into words regarding the new function and uses of war, Van Creveld's masterpiece was a strategic midwife putting words on a structural change that happened almost only in the wake of the publication of the book. So, the puzzle is simple. The book came out at a time of structural change. After another round of structural change, is the book's approach still useful? To answer this, we need two things. A brief recap of what defines the new era, the period after the post-Cold War. I feel really sorry for the post-Cold War period. It never even got its own name, and now it's over. So, too bad. And we need, secondly, to play with the notion of non-Trinitarian warfare. So first, the new era that we are in. If the Cold War is the first foundational national security era after World War I, the Stunde Null, the period after the Cold War is the second such foundational era. I think following Crimea, we have now entered a third foundational era in national security. What defines this new era? Well, the new US national security strategy summarizes this as an era of strategic competition. That message heralds a return to great power politics. In the level below, in military affairs, this also means a recurrence of the salience of deterrence to witness the busy and extensive and expensive, I might add, adaptation of NATO with regard to Russia since 2014. But does deterrence equal that we go back to Trinitarian warfare alone? Can we forget about non-Trinitarian challenges? I argue not. First of all, because the strategic context makes more than deterrence salient. The stability, in spite of all of the uncertainties of deterrence, means that confrontation between strong antagonistic states push the logic of confrontation down below the threshold of war. Clausewitzian war, interstate war, and industrial war, that is. Moreover, many threats and challenges do not stem from the strength of other states, but rather from the weakness of other states. So what I propose in more academic terms is to investigate the book's strategic usability on this new third period. We can do this by playing systematically with the Trinity to take away one constitutive element, either the armed forces, to take away the government, or to take away the people at a time, and then examine the consequences. And the questions then for each case becomes, how and by whom will war be fought? What repercussions will follow from the elements that we take away? Almost take away, because we still think in Trinitarian terms, so even if we take it away as a vision, we will still act Trinitarianly in our instincts. And finally, why will it matter to us from a national security perspective? The first of the three, and perhaps I think the most challenging of them, is this. Oh, I jumped a slide already, fair enough. Subversion. Subversion is a warfare without the armed forces. It is the most marked feature derived from the new strategic structural conditions. With a return to strategic confrontation among strong antagonistic states, many analysts would also predict a return of good old-fashioned state-on-state warfare following the Clausewitzian logic. Yet, I think Van Creveld's powerful analysis also holds true here, even if for reasons that the book would probably not agree with, as it scoffs at deterrence. But deterrence, to my mind, is, in spite of all the ambiguity, exactly what keeps the strong states from using armed force against one another. So, to paraphrase Lenin, you might disregard deterrence, but it still protects you. How is this then relevant for subversion? Well, subversion is those warlike, antagonistic activities that states undertake at the level below war, but above the level of normal politics. Because deterrence generally works, increased tensions are managed through deterrence, but also pushed by the equilibrium down to the level below, much like transformation of war described a similar logic for asymmetric conflict. This kind of war is without front lines and almost, if not completely, without immediate victims. Hybrid and cyber threats, efforts to tamper with elections, to spread fake news, and outright sabotage are included here. This might seem like minor nuances, but at the high end, subversion is about winning over a country's elites, or at least to seduce or attract central member of the elites to your point of view. In the long term, you can then foster counter-elites, you can undermine the legitimacy of the government in question to affect regime change or set the conditions for insurgency and sedition. And finally, you can make the country change sides. This is what's at stake ultimately in subversion. The idea of an absence of chance also gives us some hints as to the time-space modality in this kind of future war. If there are no front lines and no time of battle or non-battle, efforts, like in the realm of cyber, can be planned years ahead, lie dormant in enemy systems, and be executed with minimal warning. The friction of battle does not disappear, but it's transformed as attack and defense now have very different timelines. Equally, subversive active measures such as mimetic tactics to create confusion, to create delay, and create opposition, they undermine the intuitive understanding of the commander's craft related to chance, because they warp the playing field for those who are unprepared and do not know that this is going on. Finally, we should note that even if subversion is also relevant to the military, it's a warlike expression of state confrontation where covert, paramilitary, or purely civilian entities beyond normal regulatory control are the most obvious lead actors. The vision of a war without armed forces should scare the armed forces for budgetary reasons, or challenge them to become relevant in this game. From a perspective of democratic control, here not with the military as the subject and agent of war, but rather those covert organizations, this is a monitoring nightmare, not least because the politicians do not always want to look too closely at such things. The explosive growth of the United States Joint Special Operations Command and its NATO equivalents may just be a harbinger of things to come. And finally, strategically speaking, the highest risk related to subversion, much beyond regulation, has to do with actual control of this vital strategic instrument. How do we defend against subversion? Is it not a task for the armed forces? How do we control how and whether subversion is something we do on the offensive? Now, the second example, warfare without government, is another non-Trinitarian kind of future warfare that we can foresee by twisting the model. Warlordism most closely represents the paradigm that the transformation of war heralded. This goes in particular for the case where one highlights the underlying constitutive element of reason. Here, as Van Creveld writes, the logical government strategist has to reckon with the use of organized violence for its own sake. That instead of pursuing some rational goal, your opponent, quote, man picks up a weapon in order that he may fight, unquote. How do you plan for that? How do you fight an enemy that's just in the game to be in the game? But even warlordism in a more well-known sense is a challenge to our ingrained military versus civilian division of labor systems. Still, after 25 years, with comprehensive approach, coin stabilization and projecting stability. And David Kilcullen can attest to this. After having tried to convince everybody how to do it, we still don't know how to do it. We're talking here about the use of organized violence in a setting with weak states, with low reach and low legitimacy, by actors who are not states, but who, paradoxically, rather like tiny planets who have their own atmosphere, have their own micro-order of all human dimensions, from security over essential and social services to political order containing some kind of client-patron grievance-solving mechanisms. Think of the movie Godfather, where everybody lines up in front of the capo di tutti capi to make him solve this or that problem. That's the kind of role that a warlord has. It's way beyond warfighting. It's about creating a microcosm of actually a kind of political order. So for the West, we have not yet solved this challenge, and I suspect we have to understand such violent actors much more like entrepreneurs. They may be murderous and villainous entrepreneurs, but as economic actors navigating a political, regulatory, and indeed moral vacuum, trying to optimize their position in the market. None of our Trinitarian stovepipe systems are able to articulate strategies that combine military and political economy. And so warlordism will continue to come back and bite us unless we draw up the drawbridge to the south. Finally, we can consider a warfare without the people, without passion. Such a warfare will be disembodied in two ways. First, it will be fought increasingly without a human in the loop. This especially concerns space, air, and sea assets. It's a future that looks like Skynet in the movie Terminator. I'm happy that other people have already referenced that. Warfare will finally leave the human constraint of the fighting season. Another of Martin van Creveld's great books, Supplying War, I can really recommend that one too, shows that before the explosion engine, before the railways, we could only fight about 3 weeks a year. After the harvest, so there was food for the horses, and before the rain started. But that is exploded by the fact that warfare in this way can take place 24/7, it can be permanent and global, and it can be immediate and local at the same time. The absence of people in this kind of warfare breeds the potential, though, and that's an upside in theory, for a limited, deliberately designed warfare without humans in the vicinity, machine on machine, which in lieu of immediately progressing towards absolute war, in some programmatic way produces a market equilibrium, some low-level tit-for-tat where machines fight each other over the Pacific. However, those images also build on the supposition that government or the commander is without passion, in spite of being human, something that I find doubtful. So basically, a disembodied war in this way risks immediately turning itself on the humans, uncontrolled, much like the automated selling that drove the 1987 stock market crash in New York. The second way that the disembodied warfare is taken, the second body that the disembodied warfare is taken away from is the body politic. And in this way, the absence of the people means a further decoupling from democratic assent. We see this already in the 1% of the American population fighting America's wars. Civil-military relations are brittle when society as a whole does little fighting. Increased tech content in our armed forces and our defense planning is also driven by a rejection of war by the civilian body politic, which takes peace for granted and does not want to even understand or engage in this deeply fundamental problem. So in this world, non-democratic authoritarian regimes stand to profit from a form of war which is built on and for a lack of democratic control. So I think in the end, in spite of current Western technological advantage, this is a future that fundamentally challenges us, especially at the nexus between values and strategy. So to sum up, in conclusion, Martin van Creveld's book, The Transformation of War, is still useful as it helps us to understand and describe the prevalence of dangerous, decidedly non-Trinitarian aspects of current and future war. And what these elements, warlordism, robotics, and not least subversion, show is that a doggedly Trinitarian approach to defense planning, which pours money into building heavy brigades, for example, with little systematic recourse to alternatives, is a sure way to wind up in a cul-de-sac later on. Thank you.
Well, another 3 fascinating presentations, and I think I should inform you that those of you who stayed here all day have witnessed a miracle. I don't think I've ever been to a full-day conference before where all speakers basically were able to deliver their remarks on time. And over to you. The bar's open for questions. And again, please try to, copy some of the disciplines that you've experienced for up here by asking short and sharp questions or making short and sharp comments so that as many people as possible have time to actually say something. Yeah, General.
Thank you. Question, the nuclear dimension, which has to a certain extent decoupled deterrence with conventional forces as we are experiencing it today. Why are Western armed forces not capable to deal with a conventional threat as it's potentially coming from the East? And I would particularly turn to Dr. Olivier Schmidt. I would to a large extent say that it is due to a maybe over-optimistic dependence on the dimension of nuclear deterrence and the fundamental question whether nuclear weapons can be used or not. I hope I was short enough.
Olivier?
Yeah, thanks, General, for this question. Are we sure we are not able to deal with a threat from the East? In the sense that none of us is probably envisioning World War II type of large tank battles, but none of us is also really envisioning a kind of Cold War thinking of a large battle on the Fulda Gap, right? If you look at the Russian military capabilities as well, I mean, of course, they have drastically improved over the past, let's say, 10 years. But I'm hard-pressed to think that they could roll down towards Berlin tomorrow and wipe out all of Eastern Europe. It will require a relatively tough fight, but they don't want to do that because they still fear our conventional capabilities. So in that sense, we are not that bad at doing conventional deterrence. The problem that we have is something that we've been discussing on in different with our different speakers, is that they have been really good at outmaneuvering us in a zone of conflict in which we are not really comfortable, which is not state-on-state conventional warfare, which is much more diverse in terms of line of operations type of conflict. And I think part of the problem is that there is a degree of denial regarding the fact, at least in some countries, there is a degree of denial regarding the fact that they consider us as being already in a state of conflict. Not all Western countries consider themselves as being in a state of conflict with Russia. And so I think the problem mostly lies in this unacknowledgement of a degree of conflictuality, which leads to very diverse and uncoordinated and, in a sense, race to the bottom type of answer. I don't think that the deterrence moves that we are doing in the Baltic is bad per se. I think it's the absolute minimum that NATO could agree on, and it's certainly not what the best possible answer to the diverse line of operations that the Russians are using is.
Professor Kuga?
Yes, this is a question addressed to David. Can you draw a distinction between citadels and cantonments? In Afghanistan, the British didn't build citadels in their 2 Afghan wars. They built cantonments because they didn't expect to stay. So the cantonment is usually a feature of expeditionary warfare where you go in and you go out. It's very boring, of course, to be in a cantonment, and you spend most of your time thinking that you've pacified the country, even though the whole thing is falling apart around you. It's not just the British experience. You can read Tolstoy's Haji Murat, which is also quite interesting, before Chechnya had been fully pacified, where it's so boring that people dress up as Chechens and go out and take pot shots at people at weekends simply to relieve the boredom. There's something called cantonment fever. There's nothing called citadel fever, as far as I know. Do you wish to say something about the mentalities that citadels produce? Because that's what basically we're talking about, how we see war, how we understand our own position in a country. And if you want to say something about cantonments, can you say something about them too?
I can be brief. I cannot draw a hard distinction between cantonments and citadels. So thank you very much. That is some superb food for thought. I think that there's some self-evident overlap there. And in fact, the 2 references you just gave are already pinging in my mind with Haji Murat. So no, I think that for the time being, I suspect I'm using them synonymously, but I may be incorrect to be doing that. So thanks.
Yeah, please go ahead.
So I want to follow up on Christopher's comment about fortifications, just to challenge you a little bit, Dave, on southern Afghanistan, and also sort of explore this idea a little bit more. I spent a lot of time, as you did, with the Marines in southern Afghanistan, and I spent even more time with the French and the US Army in the east and the north. And I was really struck by the different cultural approach to security. And I would shorthand it by saying that Army are campers, Marines are hikers, right? So a Marine unit thinks that it's secured an area when it's passed a mobile patrol over every foot of that area and fought anybody that wants to fight it. An Army unit thinks it's secured an area when it's put a camp on every position that it can put a camp on and can dominate the area by fire. And that actually, I don't mean that as a criticism, right? I mean, that's just an observation, sort of value-free. But it suggests that the culture of combat, the combat culture, drives the fortification culture. And you didn't use the example, but I'm sure you know the Sandeman system on the Pakistan border, which is British frontier post, was designed as a machine to project governance, whereas army camps in Afghanistan are designed as a machine to project fire, and Marine, I wouldn't even call them camps, Marine halting places are designed just as a place to sleep and get some food down before you go back on your mobile move. So I wonder whether your future archaeologists looking at these fortification patterns would be able to tell something about the military culture of these future conflicts based on that. Final comment would be, I don't know the history of Wales, but I can tell you, as I'm sure you know, that in southern Afghanistan, the conflict areas that you showed on your map came after we put the forces there. Right, we didn't put the forces there because it was violent. The violence came because we decided to occupy those locations. So it's worth asking yourself, would we have been better to not make any fortifications at all?
Good questions. You started off, though, mentioning the French, but you didn't get to the French. But if I may answer your question that you didn't ask with an aside. First off, the combat outpost I pointed out there, that was a Marine establishment. So the Marines are, and it had been handed off. I believe, from a British Army unit, there may or may actually I wouldn't dispute. I think there is a difference in institutional culture between the Marines and the Army. I think that's obvious, and I also think that the Marines are probably more less cautious, more inclined to patrol out. I don't think that fundamentally changes, however. As I said, that was a Marine outpost. That doesn't fundamentally change that you erect marching. In that case, that's more of a marching camp than a citadel. That you erect these things when you put forces into a perceived hostile area that you don't have full control over, and you need to provide the wherewithal for temporary ability to resist until reinforced. Forts on the Northwest Frontier Province. I wish I could have talked about Sir Charles Taggart a lot more. Sir Charles Taggart is a fascinating figure, particularly if you're into the counterinsurgency literature. And there, it's one of the fascinating things is Taggart doesn't appear in the counterinsurgency literature, although he was, I would argue, aside from after Caldwell, probably the preeminent counterinsurgent of the whole of the British imperial era. Most of his career was in India on the Northwest Frontier Province. His ideas for the Taggart Fort come directly from his experience on the Afghan Northwest Frontier Province, essentially in that area. The design, he talks about this extensively in his design ideas. As for the French, he didn't ask this question, but I'm going to take the liberty of making another remark about the French, a nice remark about the French too. I mean, who beat us in brevity today. But also, I did interview a French unit in Afghanistan that was similarly in one of these combat outposts, one of these HESCO, and they hated it. But they hated it for what I thought was the excellent reason. They said this sends a completely opposite message to the people around here. It isn't awesome. It makes us look like Mongols or worse, like tourists. We're here and we're moving on, and that is not how we win this. The guys on the ground, they perceived that very, very clearly. I heard that repeated many, many times in that area by the French. On the other hand, that is not right. They're not making the strategy. They are responding to the same political dilemma that everyone else is, which is the fact that, look, if you lose one of these outposts, or if you experience a tactical setback, that could be a stop button on your national contribution to that campaign. That is a big difference nowadays, right? In the old days, you could have Gordon of Khartoum gets his head chopped off. The Mahdi drags his head around in a leather sack for 3 weeks, showing off this thing, But by the time those scenes, how does the British public of the 19th century remember it? Well, that's romanticized. They see his end where he's fighting it out to the last bullet, waving his sword at the right. Whereas now, as likely as not, we'd be watching that if in close to real time. An ambassador gets their head chopped off. That's probably going to be, that's going to be on your phone in minutes, if not immediately. That is a big change. Anyway, off topic, but kudos to the French on the low level, at least, and to the Marines for that matter. And if there's any U.S. Army, I like you guys too.
Professor Creveld.
David, thanks for a wonderful talk, but just one comment.
Mike, a little closer to the mouth, otherwise people can't hear.
Pardon? Just closer to the mouth. David, thank you for a wonderful talk, but I would like to correct you on one point. The British lost in 1939. They may have won in a military sense, although I don't know what that means, but the uprising, the Arab uprising, as it was called, only ended after the rulers of the Arab states intervened, and every single demand of the Palestinians was met. So politically, it was a total disaster.
Okay, very astute comment, as I would expect, and thank you very much. I think we need to argue this one out. I would say that was a game that was called on account of rain. In this case, the outbreak of the Second World War, which clearly the mandate and the whole of the British Empire didn't survive that experience. I don't think that the history, the timing is very inopportune for separating all the variables at work here. What we can say is there was an Arab revolt. It goes from 1936 to 39. There was a substantial investment by the British in this particular system, which looks very much like we would historically expect any pacification system to operate. Then you get another event coming in from the other side, which changes everything. And of course, we never return to that story. It could be a very good drinking game to hypothesize the subsequent events had Hitler not invaded Poland, Britain not been bankrupted by the Second World War, or effectively bankrupted. But thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Mose.
So when we came up with the title for this panel, the non-technological drivers of future conflict or future war, we were pretty sure that someone would touch upon, the very least, the relative decline of the West. A trend that has been going on for 5 decades and will probably go on for another, at least couple of decades or more. So I'll just invite you to speculate a bit. How will that actually affect the way we fight and the wars that we are going to be engaged in for the next 2 or 3 decades?
Well, I think that is it's done. So, I think that is to a large extent already contained in the headline of subversion. So all of those antagonistic activities below the level of war, but above the level of normal politics, that has only become possible because of the decline of the West, because of the retrenchment in the short term, first of President Obama, later of President Trump, which have much more in common than you might assume. But also in the relative decline of the West in terms of the relative share of GDP in the world and the rise thus of Asia. I think the immediate effect of the retrenchment of the US, the lack of upholding the red line in Syria by Obama and later equivalent actions by President Trump means that all of the states, not just the great powers, but all of the states outside of the West feel, if not liberated, they're not much less compelled to behave in good order than they used to. This is a de facto erosion of many of the norms of the rules-based international society. And so what we're seeing is an increasingly daring set of states that do things that we find abhorrent, but that they 5 years ago would not have dared to do. You can see the Khashoggi affair, you can see the Novi Shok attack, and many other things. And I acknowledge that this is not war in Professor Van Creveld's sense that there is immediate violence, but the implications are just as strong. You see fighting over Hungary. Will we lose Hungary, in air quotes, because of a fostering of counter-elites and attraction and undermining of the legitimacy of the West. That is what the game is about now. And the problem is, I think, because of that, we are in a situation where the armed forces, the military, are running the risk of becoming increasingly relevant to the biggest national security problem at hand, unless they struggle aggressively with understanding exactly the challenge that Kilcullen and myself, in a much lesser way, try to draw up. So I think that inside the agenda of subversion, which is the statecraft of doing this, that statecraft only exists because of the relative fall of the West.
Olivier first, and then...
On top of what Henrik just said, and I 100% subscribe to what you just said, I think part of the decline of the West is also self-inflicted for two reasons. The first one is, I think David touched upon it, and I tried to address it as well, this type of mentality to use military force in terms of risk management, because it leads to this mentality I was talking about of using military force in terms of punishing bad behavior, which in itself is apolitical and prevents Western countries from thinking strategically about their place within the international system and what they want to achieve with the use of military force. The second problem that I see is that in terms of self-inflicted wounds, was that one of the core strengths of Western countries was a degree of political agreement on a number of core identity values, which are now being completely eroded. With support from external actors, that's for sure, but also we do it ourselves, right? It's just the way political trends are going right now. And that is part of undermining the Western status within the international system. And all this is also self-inflicted. So I will think that although there are clear challenges with the rise of China, the rise of Asia in general, in terms of share of GDP and importance within the world system, we could probably be better at handling this with a kind of reinforcement around what used to be one of the core Western strengths against the Soviet Union, for example, which was a degree of unity in terms of our political objectives. And we don't have that, at least to a much lesser degree right now, and we see a degree of decoupling between the US and Europe that is also relatively self-inflicted. I mean, the US population has voted, and we see the consequences. So all this is all a bit self-inflicted, and we need to I think address the consequences when it comes to the use of military force, and we need to think hard about what that means for our adversaries, but also for our allies.
Just quickly, I'd make 3 points. First, I think we've been subverting the shit out of the world for generations, right? And what did we expect them to do? Roll over? Accept to be remade as something that they are not? I think this is hubristic. We need to get over it. The second is, I think we're bad at small wars. This is probably not, I don't think that's controversial to say. But I think the reason why we are bad, why I think we are bad at small wars is a bit controversial, and that is that we attempt to fight essentially conflicts which are moral in a very passionless way. And it just doesn't work, right? If you fundamentally don't believe in the utility of force, but your enemies do very, very passionately, then that tends to equalize things Martin van Creveld said this very well this morning in slightly different in terms. On top of that, we're nearly broke, right? These are very expensive wars to fight. I mean, you can't go around having $100 milkshakes under the table in Kandahar on a regular basis. It's a suicidally stupid way to organize your strategic affairs over a long period. It may be, if I were able to make the choice, I would say, don't do it. Don't go into, don't do small wars. Stay away from them. The West is ill. The West needs to get a grip of itself, and maybe it needs a generation of strong retrenchment and contemplation of itself. And we still have, I think we still have enough strength, physical and strength and wealth to do that. Whether we have the intelligence to do that, I don't know. But anyway, it's going to, and the suggestions I'm making, if we do go down the course of fighting these wars, is that, let's be honest, we have to look a lot more imperial. Right? Most of what I'm talking about are aspects, we understand how this works. They are well-worn techniques of imperialism, and that may well put countries off. Probably should. But if we don't do it, I think China probably will. Maybe we can live with that. I will quote Top Gear. You know the film, not the film Top Gear, the program Top Gear. I invite you to go and watch the Top Gear episode where they go to Africa and they drive powerful cars. On the Top Gear episode, they said they were driving on these Chinese highways, Chinese-built highways, and they said, these are the best highways we have ever driven on. These are guys that are driven on every continent, including Antarctica. China is already there in Africa doing this stuff, but they're enforcing contracts, they're securing the basics, nothing, almost nothing more. They are not telling people how to live their lives. They're not even doing public health stuff, and they may win.
I've closed the list, and I'll just come with a two-finger. I mean, just how much has the West really declined? Why is it that Russians have become so aggressive? Because we've almost moved to Moscow with the NATO and the EU. There's a reason why they feel extremely under pressure, and you can sort of understand that from the Russian perspective. So I have some difficulty with this notion that we're really, really so weak. Why is it they're fighting us asymmetrically? Why is it they're not taking us on conventionally or with nuclear weapons, to get back to the general's first point? It's because they fear our conventional capacity. It's because they fear our nukes. That's why they're up to all these new things, because we've used these conventional forces that Henrik is saying now is becoming obsolete. It's because you are so bloody effective that they're doing all this stuff to us. So in that sense, you're the next list. I just want to push you back a little bit on this. And then what did we learn in Afghanistan? What did we learn in Iraq? We can't civilize these places. So now we are back to colonial policing. We're doing this stuff with drones. We're killing a lot more people than the Royal Air Force was ever capable of when they were bombing Arab villages in between the two world wars. So I mean, just how weak are we? I mean, I get the point with decline, but I mean, aren't you overdoing it? And the general is the last on the list, and then you're all three, invited to fire back.
A couple of remarks. The first one addressing your remark concerning the Russians. You might be surprised, but to some extent I agree with what you are saying.
I'm surprised.
Because for the very simple reason, very few of our Western leaders know anything about Russia, maybe apart from Chancellor Merkel, who at least also speaks the language. And on top of that, how many decision makers, be they political or military, have ever bothered to turn around the map and look at the world as seen from Moscow? it suddenly looks very different from what we perceive as our understanding of the world. Now, I'm not using this as an excuse that we should not be doing anything about Baltic states, defense of NATO members. That's a completely different dimension. But we haven't bothered much to look at the way the world looks from Moscow, and that makes a dialogue with the Russian extremely difficult. And I know it because I'm involved in dealing with retired Russian generals, and I can tell you we start with Adam and Eva every single time, and all the failures of the West and how we have misunderstood the Russians, etc., etc. But so be it. I would like to go back to Afghanistan, maybe starting by quoting Secretary of Defense Jim Mattis. We are not winning. And I think that I have noticed that during the conversation we have had on Afghanistan, in whichever way we fought it, I didn't hear the word strategy. What was our strategy in Afghanistan? And implicitly, why did we go in Afghanistan and why did we stay? And I would very much like to pick up also on your second remark. Afghanistan are the Middle Ages with 16 to 18 million mobile phones. And if we look at how long it took us to get out of the Middle Ages, I'm not terribly surprised that we didn't get Afghanistan out of the Middle Ages over a decade. There's still a long, long way to go. And then brings forth the whole issue of strategic patience. Does the West have strategic patience? And my answer will probably be, at this stage, no.
Over to you. Where do you want to start?
Yeah, let's go about the order you spoke then.
All right.
All right, I have no further remarks. So.
I love the French.
I want to drink, so.
Henrik?
I spoke last, but I'll do it now then. Fair enough. Okay, fair enough. Yeah, no. I would like to take issue with the fact that you insinuated that I said that the military was obsolete. I don't think so. I think what we're seeing is that the conflict is being pushed down to the level of the threshold below war, but above normal politics, exactly because deterrence works and because deterrence is and that task is important. Because if we didn't do it right, then we might risk something at that level. But I think, and that's why. But that conflict is only intensified because we have stopped putting pressure. The West has stopped putting pressure on the rest of the world, and that's why that task is becoming more and more important. And the military, unfortunately, is not really, and we could see that from David Kilcullen's presentation, is not ready to grasp and deal with the issues of that level between normal politics and below war.
I don't think we're weak relative to Russia. Russia's not. I fall very much on the southern front threat bit. I don't think that Russia's a threat. It may indirectly be one. Going back to TX's presentation, I think if the Russians were to sell their non-export version of the Caliber K system to other powers, like pick one, Zimbabwe or whatever, that would mean we probably couldn't go in there. It would elevate the costs of doing that. That would be pretty. Yeah. Well. Okay. Maybe. But long term, Russia's the prize, to steal a phrase from counterinsurgents. Yeah, I'd rather have Russia in my camp. The Latvian Prime Minister said years ago that the problem they faced was the fact that they don't reproduce. Right? The Baltic states have a negative population growth. And anyway, if the Russians invaded, who's going to fight? It's going to be old people, a handful of people. All the young people are mostly out. They'll be on the first EasyJet flight to Munich. Or wherever. Afghanistan, in 2006, I remember David Richards, when he was the ISAF commander, giving a talk where he said, look, if we don't solve X, Y, A, B, C, and D, then we're going to lose this war. D was fix Pakistan, or I paraphrase. Arguably we did A, we didn't touch B, we didn't touch C, and D is as misdefined terrifyingly, so the writing's been on the wall for 12 years. I did a very telling interview in Kabul with one of the guys responsible for the information campaign, who was a senior American officer, who was describing the whole campaign, and he said, well, we went to Afghanistan to get rid of Al-Qaeda and deal with the Taliban, and then he looked off into the distance and he said, we just stayed. And you could see the ... come out of there, and that was all. Right? So, yes, we haven't won, and we lost in 2006. We probably lost in the 5 weeks after when we decided to stay and not just bolt, frankly.
Thank you very much. And I do hope that in spite of Peter vastly exceeding the rights and privileges of moderators, you will join me in thanking the panel and the moderator. Now the conference is drawing to a close, and I have to admit that I walk away slightly scared, but also vastly smarter, or at least I understand more, I think. If I'm to tell you two personal anecdotes that probably will belittle myself, nonetheless I'll tell them. Jens Rensmos and I went to Iran together with David Kilcullen, who's one of the organizers of the conference, a little under a year ago. And the brigadier who is heading up protocol and with us constantly, he every morning he approached us and said, "Good morning, who are you?" And we thought, you mean, how are you? Only after this conference do I understand that he actually meant what he said. He was trying to learn his enemy to know. And the other anecdote is also something that I sort of ridiculed over the years, but I understand now that I shouldn't have. It was in 2010 at the sort of in the late fighting season out in Afghanistan, in Camp Leatherneck, where my American U.S. Marine Corps two-star commander, and I was sitting at the patio wondering why we had yet again won another brilliant tactical victory down in the district of Nadali, and I was just complaining that it was making it very difficult for me to promote governance into the same district. And he looked at me slightly tired with the sort of the look of, oh, young man, and he said, well, and I quote, "If it wasn't for this coin shit, young man, I could win this war in 2 months." I understand now. I ridiculed that at the time, and I thought that he was sort of just falling out of line with strategy and all that. But I understand now that there was a depth to the question that I didn't realize at the time. Now, I do want to thank you all for joining the conference, and not least, I want to thank all the organizers, of course, Jens and David and the whole team behind the conference, and certainly the speakers and you, the audience. It's very difficult to ruin a conference like this with speakers, audience like you. Although, Peter, you did a pretty good job at trying. Now, I've been approached a couple of times during the conference, could we have the slides promised to us? And the answer is yes. With GDPR and all that, I don't think that we dare put them up to a on a SharePoint. So what we'll do is we'll ask you to mail David Westenskov, the logistician behind the whole conference. This is his email address, and if you mail him, he'll send the presentations to you, and all the presentations have been made available by the speakers, and thank you very much for that. Now, suffers now only to send you away. I hope that you enjoyed the conference. There's very little we can do to change it if not, but thank you very much